Hey everybody, welcome to this session, which we're calling True Stories, Learning from Storytellers Inside and Outside the Museum World. I'm Dan Davis. I work at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And we have a very diverse panel today. I'm sorry you're not able to see the two of our participants who are participating by Skype, but as soon as the projector comes on, we will see them. But for right now, you can hear them. I want to just quickly tell you who each of the panelists are. Right next to me is Lene Spruce from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Welcome.
Thank you.
Aaron Harper from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. On the line, actually, the host of Invisibilia and who is currently invisible to you, Elise Spiegel. Okay. There we go. Let's see. Where'd she go? I had her there for a second. There we go. There we go.
Hi.
I'll go full screen here. That's Elise, and also from San Francisco, visiting us, singer, songwriter, cabaret performance artist Candace Roberts. So storytelling in museums, I mean, we know storytelling is kind of having a moment. It should have a moment. We love our objects, but just displaying them for their own sake is not what we want to do. We want to tell the stories behind them. Now, in my experience as a producer and as someone who runs a media department, I'm often called upon to produce a media piece of some sort that conveys what I'd call a shitload of information, right? And I think visitor studies will support my conclusion that visitors don't really want to watch or listen to information. They want drama, they want storytelling, good storytelling, and they want emotional connections. So today we're going to explore that, and really my premise here was that we have something we can learn from outside the museum world. That's represented actually by these virtual participants here. That is the outside the world, sometimes referred to by me and maybe others as the real world. So we're going to see how real that is. Can you vouch for you guys being in the real world right now, Candace and Elise?
I'm so in the real world.
Okay, I thought so. Okay. So what I want to do first is have each one of the panelists sort of, I guess, tell the story of themselves, their story. So I'm going to switch to Lene. Lene Spruce is currently a digital engagement specialist at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, which just opened. Congratulations.
Thank you.
She's building the museum's social media presence to foster learning, creativity, shared discovery as a means to transform the museum's understanding of the African American experience, American history, race, and modern society. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to show a slide now. Yes. There it is. And that was her slide that tells you her name. There you go.
So at our museum, we recently launched our video mobile storytelling initiative of Snapchat and Instagram stories. And I think for me, we really wanted to tell stories that our visitors wouldn't be able to see on our other social media platforms. So this giving visitors behind the scenes moments to iconic American history structures like the White House. So we'll go and do a Snapchat tour of the White House and talk about the stories of the African American people who lived in the White House and how that experience differs from other mobile stories we do on our social media platforms.
Next.
Yes. This is our Making History tent that we had on the National Mall. And we had a Facebook Live video booth inside of that tent where we encourage people to share their own stories to Facebook using prompt questions that talked about this moment and what it meant for them. And that was a way for our visitors to our grand opening to kind of share their experience in one of these new and cool mobile technologies. This is a Snapchat storyboard. So when we are crafting our mobile video stories, we create a storyboard to kind of iron out what we want to shoot, where we're going to have text, where we're going to have, say if we're going to shoot in front of the building by the door, we kind of outline everything that we do, and then we go into even more. You can go to the next one. in even more detail, where we actually outline the script and everything that they're saying. So if we're doing a Snapchat with our director, I'm like, Lonnie, this is your line, say this here, and then we're gonna move to this location, so we have everything ironed out. And I think we're able to produce a better story versus us just going on the fly. Some of the equipment that we use, I think that makes it really successful, are lights, mics, being able to have a phone light when it's dark outside. Also, keeping extra batteries on hand as often as we can.
Okay, thank you.
That was just a quick overview.
Yeah, quick overview. We're going to get to the discussion quickly. Erin Harper here at the table is a multimedia producer at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., where she makes documentaries, designs multimedia experiences, and curates historical photo collections for Instagram. And before that, Erin was a multimedia editor at the Chicago Tribune. So you should ask her about her transition from journalism to museum life, but don't do that right now.
Actually, I'll tell you a little bit
Okay.
about it right now. No, it's a great segue. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I love to talk about stories, and I know that you guys do too. So my backstory a little bit is that I was at the Chicago Tribune for 10 years. I come from a journalism background, and there I did very similar work that I do now, which is editing short documentaries for in-museum and online. The work is so similar, and part of the reason I was hired to join is because I wanted to blend my experience and skill set into that of the museum culture. So the Chicago Tribune, in Chicago, journalism is kind of like storytelling boot camp. You do it a little bit every day, and there's never a shortage of it. So I think the sheer volume of work is kind of what conditioned me to learn how to tell a powerful story very quickly. And that came as part of the mission of me bringing that methodology into the museum. So I think journalism influences our content in two major ways. One would be crafting that powerful story quickly, and then bringing the inspiration or kind of the gut instinct of news into what you do. So my challenge every day at the Holocaust Memorial Museum is how do we tell the story about genocide? So that's a really large-scale idea. How do we boil that down and tell that story succinctly? So I always like to bring the idea of tell a small story to tell a big story, and my most recent project is a great example of that. So these Syrian doctors, they were from Chicago. They spent a couple weeks in Aleppo saving lives in some of these hospitals that were underground being bombed, and they came back to the U.S. and they told their story. They went around the U.S. to media outlets and to our museum and told what it was like to do so. So the director of my division came to me and said, can we do this? Can we do a video? Can we do the story? And I said, yes, absolutely. That's exactly the kind of thing that we want to be doing. So I hired a freelance videographer in Chicago, and we helped her craft these interview questions and kind of guided that through. We had them retell their story and then worked with Aleppo Media Center to use some of their footage from on the ground, and we built this story. And can we take a look at it right now?
Yeah, I have an interstitial slide here, but here we go.
Is there audio?
Yep.
Right now, they're being sieged and starved and bombed. People there haven't had any fresh food, fuel, medicines, supplies, or humanitarian personnel coming in or out. The whole city is totally sealed off and cut off from the outside world.
First of all, there is no day and night. You have 24 hours of work. Every few hours you have new victims of barrel bombing or airstrikes, and you have to take care of them. I saw a patient, his name is Ahmad, 5 years old. He had shrapnel of barrel bombing in his spinal cord. Unfortunately, he died one day after I left. And this is one of hundreds of patients that the doctors and the nurses have to deal with every day. I've seen children pointing to the sky, and then you see this dot, which is the helicopter. And you hear the sound, the rumbling sound of the helicopter. And then this dot will throw another dot, and this is a barrel bomb. Barrel bomb is a big barrel that is stuffed with TNT, and shrapnels, and it's thrown on a neighborhood. It is a weapon of mass destruction. It can destroy the whole block. And the only thing that you can do if you are a civilian and you are seeing this, that you can pray and run or hide.
They feel like they've been abandoned. They feel that for years no one's been listening. They feel like they've been screaming to the world for help, and that very few have come to help them.
What can the international community do? The first thing is to pay attention to what's happening in Syria. No-fly zone or safe zones, and also maintaining access to areas under siege by having humanitarian corridors, and protect these civilians that are the victims of the war.
So I think the reason I bring this example is because it was that principle of telling a small story to tell the big story. So we told the story of the people of Aleppo while it was under siege through the lens of the doctor's experience, and they were kind of the voice that we could use in order to get into content like that. I think originally one of the reasons I was really pulling for it is it might have sounded like it was this uncharted territory for the museum, right? We've never done anything like this in a short amount of time. And I said, yes, absolutely, we can do this. These are the skills that we need. We're not breaking news in the museum, but we are staying relevant. So I think that's what's really important part pushing this is, and also recognizing that there's an inherently emotional component to this story. So it's almost like when you see these, grab hold of them and use them, because sometimes it's hard to tell the story if you don't have quite the right anecdote. So I think it's recognizing this and putting it together quickly. One thing I'm excited about is that we did get people from all over the museum to kind of join in, and even the director was with us in a meeting at a moment's notice, and we're having phone calls on a Sunday, and we put this together in 15 days from the idea of the original idea all the way to it being in the museum and one of our galleries that shows content on contemporary work.
Thanks, Erin. Let me introduce you now to, I'll put her back up here, Elise Spiegel, who has worked on NPR Science Desk for 10 years, covering psychology and human behavior, and was one of the founding producers of the public radio program, This American Life. In January 2015, she joined NPR science reporter Lulu Miller to co-host Invisibilia, a series from NPR about the unseen forces that control human behavior. Welcome, Elise.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I, like Dan said, I helped start This American Life, and what we do is actually exactly what he was talking about earlier, the importance of telling stories that make emotional connections so that you give people access to information. And that's like just like I'm guessing most of you guys, like basically your job is to take a huge amount of information and find a way to give people access to it through narratives and simplify it enough. And that's especially what we do at Invisibilia, because it's a science show, basically. So, for example, all morning long, I was writing this incredibly complicated story about the implicit association test into a narrative that, like, you don't need a PhD to kind of get access to. And so the things that I think about every day of my life are exactly the things that you guys strive to do. And I have lots of kind of small ideas about how you go about that and how you go about, getting emotion and catching attention. But Dan, am I supposed to show some of my work? Like, you have a clip there from us that maybe I'm sure that like lots of people in the room haven't heard Invisibilia. This will just give you a little bit of a sense of what we do.
Smiles are a huge part of American
More
culture.
volume, please.
You get them with your morning coffee, you get them with your lunch, you
I'm
get
up
them
all
from
the way.
vague acquaintances and total strangers you pass on the street. In America,
Hold on a second.
smiles are like air. They're all around us, which was really quite mystifying to Yuri Chekolin?
We were always a little bit afraid of America's smile.
Yuri grew up in Moscow during the 1970s and 80s, when the Soviet Union was still a communist country, in many ways cut off from the rest of the world. So Yuri didn't know a ton about America, but he knew that Americans liked to smile.
Since we were little, in school we learned that American smile, that's not honest, that's not sincere smile, that's just for show.
They would actually talk to you about the American smile and tell you how to interpret it.
Absolutely. There were like posters about those evil capitalists wearing top hats and smiling in that evil way. And, they would say, yeah, Americans smile all the time, but you shouldn't believe it.
See, in Russia at the time, smiling had a very different meaning than it did in America. Smiling was seen as a very personal, intimate thing.
In Russia, we don't smile at strangers, and like when you see your family or when you see your friends, that is when you smile. You don't really smile to anybody outside of that.
Why?
It's a long history. I mean, we have like a lot of proverbs that say like "Смех без причины признак дурачины." If you smile without a reason, it's a sign of idiocy.
Thanks, Elise. Okay. Wait. Here we go.
Smiles are a huge part of American
That's not what I
culture.
meant to do.
You get
That
them
was
with
the
your
part
morning
you didn't
coffee,
hear in the
You
beginning.
get them with your lunch.
Let me see if
You
I
get
can
them
move forward.
from
There we go. All right. So let me bring in Candace Roberts, who, as a singer-songwriter, filmmaker, and cabaret artist, she has, since 2014, released music videos calling out gentrification and income inequality, as well as a not-so-serious feminist romp about reclaiming pubic hair and our bodies. Candace's work has been covered by the BBC, the KQED, NBC, NPR, Fox News, and the San Francisco Chronicle and Bitch magazine. So Candace, go ahead and introduce yourself. I'll put you on Skype here. Welcome.
Hi. I'm essentially, yes, I live in San Francisco. I write songs and have been doing live cabaret shows in San Francisco for many, many years now. I tend to write songs all about whatever strikes me as being important, whether it's issues of self-acceptance and body image, write songs about cellulite and handbags, our obsession with handbags, our broken political system, and got very caught up in what's going on in the Bay Area with kind of the tech 2.0 kind of infiltration of the Bay Area. So I think, Dan, if you want to show a few videos, this would be a good moment.
Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go. There we go.
Now she's not my city anymore. No, she's not my city anymore.
I cook your food, wait your table, serve your cocktails. Where's my tip? I teach your kids, wipe their asses, walk your dogs. I suck your dicks, write your songs, paint your murals, haul your garbage, wax your beef.
Funny who decide to reward while the rest of us make tax breaks or bus stops for free. I can't help but count red carpets. Are there any left for me? Oh, this city is filthy rich, yet there's crisis in the streets. Hello from the other side. The Google bus don't give no on, I'm feeling free. Only get so far, says he just can't hang. We'll see the forest for the trees. I'm not so.
Okay. All right. So
I love the diversity of the media here.
I knew the transition might be a little rough, but you know what, we're one
Nothing
thing
like a little pubic hair in the morning.
That's right. Good morning, everybody. Okay. So, a key challenge for our museums, but really for all of us, which is why I invited us all to talk about this, is really the question of relevancy. Museum visitors come and, you worry that they're even thinking to themselves, hopefully not saying out loud, but why should I care about this? Why does it matter to me? So I think with storytelling, we can do that. And I wanted to, go back to Aaron talking about stories in response to news and current events. 'Cause I think that's one way we can stay relevant. If you want to talk a little bit about that your work.
Sure. So I think this was a good example of how to design content that's fitting into the narrative of what people are already talking about. So there are relevant issues in the world that we do want to draw attention to, but if you can start where people are and just listen to what they're talking about, that's something that they will react to emotionally, and it will feel so relevant in their own lives. Also, I work on the Instagram account for the museum. It's at Holocaust Museum on Instagram, and we take photos that are from our archives. They're historical photos, and we use ones that are relevant and kind of mirror what's happening in today. And it's important that we don't compare the past to the present. That's part of our boundaries on how we do things. But we do reflect what is relevant, such as refugees, refugee camps, in the time of World War II, still happening now. So providing that content, but helping people, allowing them to make the connections by themselves, but really staying in focus on what are people talking about and how we can meet them there.
I invite any of our panelists to pick up the thread, but let me ask Lene, when we talk about sort of relevant stories and we're talking about history, what are the challenges there? Because, sometimes it's trying to help people make those connections. What have you done to sort of make those stories relevant when you're talking about history?
So I think at our museum, especially on social media, it is important that we showcase the historical moments. You think about the current Black Lives Matter movement. We have tons of images and photographs in our collection of protesters from the civil rights movement. So oftentimes, with the support of our public programming, we're able to use our social media to kind of talk about the historical facts and how those events have kind of mirrored things that go on today. But we also can use, I think, our mobile storytelling tools like Snapchat to offer additional insight from our curatorial team. So oftentimes we're all in the same building now. I'll go knock on our curator's doors and I'm like, hey, come out here, give me 15 minutes of your time and let's go to the exhibition and let me get a quick moment of you talking about something on our Snapchat channel. And that's something that I think once we are fully staffed that we'll be able to do a lot more in regards to current events. I really wanted to do a story on blackface on our Snapchat channel, but I didn't have enough time. I was making it to MCN, but we have a whole exhibition that talks about the history of blackface and derogatory material, so I think that's something that would have been very relevant to today's conversation during the month of October.
So let me throw it out to Elise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for us, I think strategy is to kind of try to take things really, really deep. Like you take the news and then you just dive as deep into it as you possibly can and find a way of looking at it that people aren't going to get access to in news because in the news cycle because they don't have the time to really build out and look at all the whole backstory. So, for example, I'm doing that right now with this story about implicit bias, which is really relevant to police shootings. And then you just try to, and then for me, I actually am doing a lot of history, just like explaining how the concept came up and trying to make the people who tried to show you the people behind the concepts and how those people, what motivated them And those kinds of backstories, I feel like, essentially they provide enough context for people to be able to, navigate their world in a richer way, and they can understand the news better. So that's essentially what we're trying to do, is give more context, because we're kind of long form, and we're not trying to be on the news, because we're a seasonal show.
Elise, can you talk just about there's been a big influence from This American Life, really with the use of music and sound.
Yeah.
I mean, it really has even influenced the way NPR does its programming, because now there's a lot more interstitial music. But how do you use music and editing and tone to help make those connections? And to what extent, if any, does that ever threaten to maybe not undermine, but change sort of the authority of what you're doing?
Okay, so I fully believe in music, and I use music to emotionally draw people into whatever story it is that I'm telling, or sometimes to play off the story in some way. Now, I will say this, I am not in part of the news department right now. I'm, and in fact, NPR does not and will not allow news pieces to have music under them, because they feel like it is too manipulative. I mean, every once in a while you'll get a feature story that's that has music under it, but it is very, very rare. And when I was just working on the science desk as a science reporter, they didn't let that happen. So, but for me, I obviously do come out of the This American Life tradition, and it gives, like, from my perspective, it just gives people access, and that, like, to the information by creating an emotional connection. Ooh, are you still there?
We see just a big dot that says "in," so your video.
Oh, there I am.
There you are. Okay.
Sorry about that. So that's my job, is to give people access, and I feel like, in the context of the long form work that I'm doing, it is appropriate to use. Probably, my opinion, probably appropriate to use in the context of your museum too, because essentially it's just another element that you can use that will help people to listen and can reach out and grab them. So I'm a huge believer in it, but it's not allowed in news.
Right, so they definitely draw a line there. And Candace, let me bring you in a little bit. I mean, I really feel like it's a little uncharted territory, because I don't know where the Venn diagram overlaps, but I do know that when we look to artists for innovation, you have less constraints as far as how you can tell stories. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the stories you choose to tell, how you tell them, and then, just all the elements that go in there to help engage your audience.
Yeah, I'd say I definitely have so much freedom. I can write about whatever I want, obviously. And I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I think I just felt so compelled these last few years to write about what was going on around me. It's essentially just about heartbreak and seeing so many of my friends forced out of the city. There's an eviction epidemic. There's a huge gentrification experience happening in the Bay Area right now, in San Francisco in particular, and Oakland. And I feel like, going to parties for the last few years, it's all everyone talks about. I was walking around on the streets. There's new high-rises springing up all over the place. And I was walking in the Castro neighborhood and saw a new one, and I said, wow, this is not my city anymore. And then this melody came, this song came, and there was that song. And then the issue just kept persisting, and I made Hello, Ed Lee, which is, Ed Lee is the mayor of San Francisco, and there's been a lot of critique of how kind of spoon-fed or rolled out the red carpet for the tech industry at the expense of so many people, so many communities that have been pushed out of San Francisco and the Bay Area. And just writing about kind of the heartbreak I've experienced in a city that I'm so in love with. has changed incredibly over the last few years, and it's really inhospitable to so many of us, artists, working class people, people of color, and that's most of what I've been writing about in terms of what's going on in the Bay Area, what's happening around me, and then there's other topical things like the Take Back Your Beavers song. Many years ago, I was rejected by someone sexually for possessing pubic hair. It's illegal these days to have it, I'm learning. And so I would go to parties, and my friends would always be like, hey, tell that story about how you were rejected that one time, because it's a big hit, real funny story, and people love hearing about it. And so I wrote a song, and people just, I guess my friends are great influencers in informing me about what I should be writing about or singing about, things that they find relevant and funny, or they want to hear those stories over and over again. So, yeah, and there's some about cellulite, some about handbags, some about, I don't know, wanting to go to the dentist rather than being depressed. I don't know, all sorts of things like that.
So thinking about that for working in museums, how do you, I guess Lene or Aaron, you can pick up on this if you wish, you know, what's your personal voice? So if you're using social media or you're producing something, how transparent is your personal perspective? Or is that a way to connect, or is there some downside to that?
I think for our Snapchat account, we intentionally developed a persona for our Snapchat. It was a young girl, and we were seeing the lens through her eyes. And I actually had Kai, when we were doing our grand opening campaign, take our viewers behind the scene for all of our donor events. She went around the city and did everything like that. And it was a really intentional campaign because I wanted to be really personalized. And I wanted people to feel like they can make a connection between our grand opening and have kind of like an inside access point. And I think it worked out very well. And it also was our goal to tell stories I think that we don't commonly see, so those stories that are outside the common narrative. So we've heard the stories about MLK, we've heard the story of Rosa Parks, but I think it's our job as a museum to talk about those unsung heroes and tell people about like Hercules. How many of you have heard of them? And that was George Washington's chef, who was classically trained. So I think we try to do a lot of uncommon narrative storytelling on our mobile platforms.
Yes, I agree. I think we probably have a lot in common, given the types of museums that are celebrating cultures. We definitely look for the personal narratives and things that you would be surprised by that our museum would tell. So, for example, we had a story on Instagram. It was a 5-part series about this woman named Florence Warren, who was a Jewish woman hiding in the spotlight, traveling all through Europe doing these ballet performances. So it's like, oh, wow, we were able to extract this lovely little narrative and tell a story that's not what you would think when you necessarily would come to us. One thing I would love to talk about is tone and voice on the social media platforms. That's definitely something that we've given a lot of thought to. As you can imagine, there's a formality to what we do. So on that platform, we want to try to achieve a voice that's conversational, that's available, but yet still dignified. So it's kind of a very narrow window, a point that you have to hit in order to meet all those marks, but still keeping the conversation and having a voice where people want to talk with you.
And I'll just add that I deliberately think our Snapchat account is very different from our other platforms like Facebook. On Snapchat, we use a lot of fun things. We can say lit. It's a very different tone, and I think that's very intentional versus because of the audience. And it's something that I think we get to have a lot of fun with. But I'm very cognizant of the way that we use different platforms and having those different tones and everything.
And Elise, maybe you could pick up on that thread just a little bit. You know,
Yeah.
how much?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is something that and I can tell you that we did, like the kind of shift from a more formal arm's length tone to a more kind of personal, subjective tone was something that was very consciously done at This American Life. Essentially, that was one of the primary innovations of that radio program, because Ira felt like the typical authoritative news stance didn't catch people in the same way that a more personal, eye-focused stance did. And And so that was, I mean, there were a variety of things that he very consciously set out to do differently. Some of them are more technical, like the way he used tape and the kinds of stories he focused on. But then some of them were these, like the shift from a more formal voice to a less formal voice. And I do think that if part of what you're trying to do is, and the shift happened both in terms of the right, like the use of the word I, but also in terms of the writing. You know, he used more less formal language and encouraged everybody to use less formal language. And I think part of the reason that This American Life was successful was because that shift was like more novel at that time, 20 years ago, and it caught people's attention. And also, when you give people, access to yourself as a reporter, then they're more likely to be invested. And so, I use a much less formal tone, and I've tried to push it even in a variety of ways. I've tried to, push it towards an even less formal direction. And so, I really believe in that as a good strategy.
Have you had an experience where you had a great story, but you couldn't find a good sort of mule to pull it along, a good person to sort of tell that story? Or how important is that? It seems like, the story is good, but you still need to find, the right personalities.
I mean, I don't know that I have encountered that. Yeah, really. I mean, sometimes, if there's a good story, like you have to make a decision, okay, is this a narrated piece? Is somebody like me going to narrate? Or, is it a non-narrated piece, which means it's just the person telling the story? Because you can always in radio, if you want to, make it so that it's just the person telling the story. So like it's a personal narrative. So, but yeah, I haven't struggled with that very much.
So I wonder if our panelists have anything, thinking about this personal tone, are there places where it really wouldn't be compatible, or you think this is something that the museum needs to move in that direction to make greater audience engagement?
I feel that we've come a long way, and I would like to acknowledge Kai here, who runs most of our social media, and she's done a great job of getting to that point where we have balance and we have the good conversation going. But thank you, Kai. Yes.
I would say, I think one of the big goals as we shift to being a fully open museum is that we will continue to use storytelling. Right now on our website, we have collection stories where we pull out objects from our collection, and we have a member of our curatorial staff offer additional insight on an object. And again, we really try to share stories that you haven't heard before from African American history, and I think that's a key component of our digital strategy, especially even when you visit our museum, is that we've put out stories from regular people and kind of showcase them, and that's something that we'll continue to do. It's very popular. One of my favorite things is hearing people say, I've never heard that, thanks for sharing, and learn more, and we're able to provide additional resources as well.
We're, in museums, we know there's a lot of constraints, not only just of money, but of time. The visitors don't have time for the deeper dive. So how do you cope with that? And I'd love to hear also from Elise and Candace and thinking of those kind of constraints, because Elise, you've also done news reports that have to be brief.
Sure, I can speak to that. I think when I arrived at the museum a year ago, I noticed that our timelines were very different. So journalism timeline, sometimes someone would come to me in the newsroom and say, hey, can we do this? And I'd say, when do you need it? And usually I would expect a response back that was like a few hours. And then I realized that that's definitely not the case in museums, that sometimes it's a few days, you at least got a few days. Sometimes you have weeks, sometimes you have years. I was like, wow, working on something for 2020, I can't even comprehend what that means. But bringing that energy to say, well, how about a couple weeks, that's when we could get that done, but also how can we bite off a manageable amount of work so we can push through and really put out a solid story. And it turns out this video that you saw was 2.5 minutes. So I was really going for something that people can digest, they can get a complete story, but you also kind of pique their curiosity to go learn more on their own.
Just quickly following up on that, what do you think why can't we be faster in the museum world in your short time at the Holocaust Museum versus?
Sure. It was a breakthrough moment for sure. I think a lot of projects, people were used to taking years. I'm not saying, rip up the meeting structure and we have to do everything, work off the clock, that kind of thing. But I think what was great was that I was able to say, here's what it would look like to get something done this quickly. So if you want to try, everyone pitching in, let's have one standing meeting every day for 1 week for 10 minutes, and you just report what happened in the last 24 hours and where are the missing pieces, where are the shortcomings. But you have to start with a full team who has the buy-in of saying, yes, we're going to do this together on this deadline. It definitely was, it made some of us uncomfortable, but that's kind of why we're here. We want to, push a boundary and do something new.
I want to add to that and say that I've been bribing our curators a little bit. During our grand opening campaign, Kai was able to get lots of reactions from every major celebrity that attended our grand opening, and I think our curators, I'm like, this video got 40,000 views, don't you want to get out here and talk to our audiences? And now whenever I get one of them to do like a Snapchat story or Instagram story, I'm like, look at our sports curator. He's on there, don't you want to be visible? So kind of getting them to kind of see what it looks like and letting them know that it's okay, doing takes. I think one of our curators, we did it over and over until they get it right. Even when Lonnie, we did our first Snapchat video with him, we're like, it's okay, making them feel calm and comfortable and kind of pushing them like sometimes we have to do things fast and it's okay. And the great thing about it is that you can start over and over on Snapchat.
Elise, you want to pick
Yeah, I have to tell you, like, I am not great at short. That's just not, it takes me like 3 minutes to say my name. But I did work in news, and I think what you have to do is you just have to kind of limit, in today's world anyway, you just have to think that the first 20 seconds of whatever it is, like, you have to grab people instantly. And how do you grab people? You grab people by giving them something that they haven't, like that you just kind of, like you have to find something that doesn't quite make sense, like the way that you this is my strategy. I start in a way where like there's something that doesn't quite make sense, and so then they're compelled to listen, or I start with the beginning of like a narrative where you get the sense that something is going to happen, and then they're compelled to listen. But I am always very, very aware, even when I'm working long, that basically we live in an incredibly crowded and noisy world where everybody is vying for attention. And so every second needs to be thought about, and it needs to shift away from the expected. In my view, like you should always try to move away from something that feels expected or known.
And at least, what's the approval process for these ideas that you have? How do you, what are your constraints?
Well, it's not necessarily in the ideas, it's in how you lay out the story. So you can have a perfectly normal thing that happens, but you have to find some way of introducing the idea that puts people off kilter, so that in the first 20 seconds they know, not even in the first 10 seconds, they know like, oh, there's something that I need to learn here. There's something that's a little bit off here. And you just don't ever take your audience's attention for granted. Never, never, never. And you think in terms of seconds, not, and I do this, I'm like doing an hour-long piece. I still think in terms of like second, what is the, how do I frame this in exactly the right way so that I maintain attention? That's always the question that I'm asking myself.
And Candace, do you ask yourself that question? How you grab the attention of the audience? I mean, you certainly grabbed our attention here.
Well, I think that doing my live cabaret shows is always a way to test out material and see how the audience responds. And then that might determine if I further develop story or a song or a video. In my live cabaret shows, I tell stories in between songs, so that's a huge component of it. Like there'll be a song and then a story that might accompany it, or I kind of come from this family that's full of humiliating tales, and so I feel like it's my audience that really helps me figure out what song or story or video to develop, because I just, it's like this workshop, everything I do, and it's very rich, so.
And how much have you explored looking at changing the form of what you do? Like you have a song form and a traditional sort of cabaret form. Do you play with that a little bit?
Like the actual song itself, or what, like?
Yes.
I mean, I definitely will take any liberties in live shows to kind of sometimes stop in the middle of a song and tell a story, or sit on somebody's lap, or stand on top of the piano. I mean, I really can do whatever I want, and it's a lot about playing off the audience. If it's a particularly great audience, I can, I don't know, I can take a poll, a survey during the middle of it, or get somebody to tell their story really briefly, or I don't know. I have like I said, I have a song about handbags. So sometimes in the middle of my handbag song, I stop and put the handbag on top of the piano and hump the handbag, because just to kind of prove this point, it's like almost like our handbags have become, almost like our lovers. Like we're so fixated on them the way we might be, like, I don't know. So I really feel like there's a lot of room to play in a live show, and then again that might inform what I might do in a video. For example, later on, some of the blocking or the imagery, the shots, all that kind of stuff.
I have lots of questions, but I also want to participate. Any kind of allow all you guys to ask a question. I don't know if there's a mic in the room, but if you have something you want to add or a specific question, please. Yes.
I think you touched upon this a little bit when you talked about tone and voice, but also the extent to which, and this is directed more toward the museum people, you're comfortable making explicitly political stances, which I think is something that museums can wrestle with, and I think also can really hold up being able to move quickly on something that's topical if there isn't a clearly articulated, like, institutional understanding of these are the topics. Like, we do have an opinion, we do have a point of view, we are willing to take a stance on something, and we can do that without having to have like 500 meetings to get consensus.
Really? Okay.
My institution's not there. I'm curious about what kind of framework there was, or to get to the point that you had, or maybe it's a struggle, but clearly you were able to do something, specifically the Syria thing, which is like, this is an assertion, this is,
right.
We are not saying, oh, there's two sides to this story. I mean, it's a very clear thing. So I'm just kind of curious about how you were able to get to a functional state in that way.
The question is regarding how we deal with maybe controversial or political topics in museums and otherwise, and out in the outside world too.
Sure. So I'll use the Syria video as an example. It's actually, perfectly on point that there was language in the beginning and the end of that film, and it did not declare that genocide had been committed, but it declared that these are the circumstances that can lead to genocide if they go unchecked. And that language, exactly how you might imagine, that was hours of debating. But I said, you guys, better figure it out in a couple hours, and they did, but putting the pressure on them kind of actually helped. But the Center for Prevention of Genocide is one of the divisions of our organization, and they are in the office with us, so they loved the project and really wanted it to get out, so we're willing to kind of make an exception and go do that. I think on a project of something that might just come in one day and we want to make a comment on it, but we don't necessarily have the whole, higher level group of the institution working on it right away, and it's not high priority. I think that stuff does fall through the cracks sometimes because we can't make a decision in time for it to still be relevant. So by the time you would put it on a blog or on a social media platform, we've all stopped talking about it. So it's like, okay, well, we'll just move on to the next one. But yes, that's a struggle for us.
In the words of Lonnie Bunch, in the words of John Hope Franklin, it's our job to tell the unvarnished truth. And I think that our social media practice supports our larger museum mission and vision. Oftentimes when we do a public program, we'll support that public program through our social media strategy. I'll develop a specific campaign where we'll showcase our collection objects. We'll have a blog that offers even more context and even more information for people who want to learn more. I remember when we had our first symposium examining police violence and activism, how much of an uproar it was. It was the first time the Smithsonian had ever done anything like that. And some of my colleagues like, oh my gosh, you guys get to tweet hashtag Black Lives Matter, but we're also, again, actively collecting objects related to that movement. We have stuff featured in our museum, and our programming and our collection supports issues related to that. So I think everything that we do is always grounded in our collections and goes back to our mission and vision.
Yes, Jeff.
Aaron, I'm so glad you made that comment about the ending, because I took note of that right away, and it made me question what is genocide, and but I would rather have. I guess what my philosophy is that the shorter the message, the more demonstrative you have to be. Because you don't have the time to do that. I realize, and I'm very aware of the political sort of underpinnings of that language, but I personally would have rather have seen no, wishy-washy, words for that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that response. I think that is difficult for audience to say, well, are you saying this is, are you saying this isn't? Because we're in part a federal institution, every word that CPG, Center for Prevention of Genocide, releases is something that has to be so clearly defined. So we're not, I'm following their suit, but they're not necessarily going to say that, declaring a genocide is a very high-level specific thing that affects policy, et cetera, that I'm not actually qualified to write with them. But yes, I agree that message isn't clear, is what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the other important part of what I said is that the smaller the soundbite, 2.5 minutes, or tweet or whatever, the clearer the message has to be. We don't have the room to. If you're doing a half-hour podcast, you have more room for the nuances.
Sure.
And so it's hard as a storyteller to make that decision without a committee. I have to make decisions about that. I deal with visual making posters, and I'm constantly trying to cull this down in a very tight way.
Yeah, succinct message, right. Anyone else? Questions?
I can say, in that thread that at the American Indian Museum, the semantics of talking about what happened to American Indians get very complicated because genocide is a term that is not really, some would argue, applicable to the 19th century. But then we say, well, how about a word like ethnic cleansing? And this is a conversation we have. What we're trying to get better at our museum is taking these stories and turning them into conversation. So if there are controversies, at least this is coming from, from below up, but also our director embraces this to an extent, that this is an opportunity to really increase that engagement and increase the story. But there is risk in that engagement. So I don't know if others have, I'm sure, Lene, you are buckling yourself up there for hopefully lots of good conversation, and I know you have lots of fans. But, Yeah.
The Holocaust Museum were able to send a team out twice to Iraq, and we came back and said there was genocide happening. So that was a huge deal for our museum to actually take a stance and say there is a genocide happening against Yazidis in Iraq. And that was, it took a lot of time. We did take our minds to the state context of our federal. So we do take stands. It just takes a lot of work in our Center for the Use of Genocide. We're doing great work.
Erin, can you just summarize what she said? Thank you.
Oh, sure. So the Center for Prevention of Genocide under the museum's wing was, we sent a couple of groups to Iraq and Burma, and in one case, when we came back, declared that there was genocide happening against the Yazidis and other religious minorities in Iraq. So the point was just that we do take a stance. We are part of an institution that does that. It's just a lot larger of a process that extends kind of beyond far our conversational voice in media. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Sina.
Did you do that based on people, visitors, responses?
I think the one reason our mission was never still happening, and it's our mission to go and inform the public of what's happening. So that was important to us. And even work for Syria, we had a Syrian sector that came, smuggled homes out, and brought to the U.S. and we have it in our museum right now. So we are constantly informing the American public of what's happening. And it's a little difficult to take that message and put it into and things like that. We do have great reports that our team has made. What we do is, it's a fine line, but it goes back to our mission of what we're trying to do to break the relevance.
So there's definitely blurrings of lines maybe in storytelling, especially staying topical and relevant between journalism and the museum work. But the structures for approval are so radically different between what journalists might need to do and museums wish to do. That's something I don't know needs to be resolved, but it's certainly going to be an issue if we want to be extremely agile. You have to have the leadership approval process to either grant autonomy, which would be pretty difficult for something controversial, or to have something quickly in place, or perhaps guidelines ahead of time that would allow you to decide which ways to go. All of this, again, for the outside world, we go into our museum speak.
No, it's okay. It was hard to hear the question a little bit.
Sorry about that. It was essentially talking about the Holocaust Museum's efforts, very active efforts to verify the things that they were saying, as far as sending staff all the way to Iraq to make sure that they were verifying it. And Elise, you must have a lot, with your background in journalism, this kind of fact-checking is all within the team. And
Yeah, well, we actually hire outside fact checkers just because we feel like, if you work on something for a long time, you kind of lose your ability to see it. And so fresh eyes are very helpful in that. But yeah, fact checking is like a huge undertaking, and we spend a lot of time on that.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this session, and thank you, Elise and Candace, for joining via Skype.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thanks for everyone out there. Okay, bye. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So long.
Thank you.
Okay, so long.
Take